Of all the crazy lore reveals in Secret of the Mimic, the one that caught me the most off guard was the fact that a map for FNAF 3 could be found in the prototype Freddy's location under the factory we explore in the game. With how FNAF 3 is set decades after FNAF 1 even at a horror attraction based on the Freddy's murders, the map for the location being around in a game that takes place in 1979 before Freddy's even existed is really weird, and that's not even getting into the fact that the prototype Freddy's itself matches FNAF 1, not FNAF 3's map like is shown in the location. But unless this was an accident on the part of the developers, which I doubt since it's in a pretty noticeable spot, and that's a pretty big detail to write off as an accident, this has to mean something. So stay tuned and consider subscribing, because not only do I think I know what it is, but I think it also helps solve some of the most controversial debates about the lore that have been going on for years. But real quick before I get into that, I've got a bit of an announcement. If you like cool pins, I've got just the limited edition pin set for you. Face Desk, Lore, Emotional Support Box, Pretty Rock. 4 pins that are only available until October 22nd at the link in the description, pinned comment, and on-screen QR code. I'm really happy with how they turned out, and I hope you like them too. Let me know which one's your favorite in the comments. But back to the topic at hand. Since it's been a while since FNAF 3 came out and Secret of the Mimic is a game we've had much less time to get familiar with, I'm going to quickly explain the important information to know about each to get everyone on the same page. FNAF 3 takes place in a horror attraction called Fazbear's Fright, not to be confused with Fazbear Frights, the book series. The attraction was based on the rumors around the Freddy's murders and was set up 30 years after Freddy's closed. I personally believe this refers to 30 years after the FNAF 1 Freddy's location closed, partially due to one of Scott Cawthon's source code teasers implying it's set 30 years after Five Nights at Freddy's specifically. Now, I don't think it makes much sense for the description to be that it's been 30 years since Freddy's closed its doors, only for those doors to have been opened during that 30-year time period. But even if it is 30 years after an earlier Freddy's closure, the earliest it would be set would be in 2015, 30 years after the missing children incident. Anyway, the Fazbear's Fright people went around trying to get legitimate stuff related to Freddy's locations, including from the old Freddy's locations themselves. And they end up finding out that the restaurants had extra rooms that were sealed up. So they rip down one of the false walls, find the spring-locked corpse of William Afton in the rotted spring Bonnie suit, and haul Springtrap back to the attraction. A few nights go by where we get some explanations for how spring locks work and why they got discontinued, and the location got set on fire and burned down. Meanwhile, Secret of the Mimic takes place on September 7th, 1979 at Murray's Costume Manor, which despite originally being separate from Fazbear Entertainment, worked for them as a contractor making costumes and character designs for them. Unfortunately, its owner, Edwin Murray, being friends with the owners of Fazbear, made it so that he missed the fact that Fazbear was bleeding his business dry to take it over. That being said, before everything went completely wrong, MCM was helping Fazbear Entertainment plan for the opening of the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza chain. The prototype FNAF 1 location in the research and development portion of the building, and the animatronics contained within were the culmination of that. There are a few interesting things there, like the Mixes machine from Ruin containing the original Mimic program, copying Edwin's wife Fiona, a Springlock Montgomery Gator costume, and of course, the FNAF 3 map. And let me tell you, the night I saw that map and everything else for the first time, I stayed up way later than I probably should have wondering about it. Fortunately, I did manage to get a good night's sleep afterwards thanks to the sponsor of this video, Manta Sleep. Manta Sleep is one of my favorite brands I've been sponsored by, and I use their products pretty much every single day. The adjustable eye cups the sleep masks have do a great job of blocking out the light, which is good when you have roommates who wake up at different times than you do, and they're very comfortable to wear. On top of that, there are a whole bunch of different kinds of masks depending on what you're looking for. Need to listen to white noise to sleep without bothering other people? Try the Manta Sound Sleep Mask, which has built-in Bluetooth speakers. Are you a side sleeper who doesn't want the mask to cover your ears? Try the Manta Pro Sleep Mask, which has C-shaped eye cups and a band made for that purpose. There's also a silk mask, the standard Manta Sleep Mask, a weighted sleep mask, a steam sleep mask, and a cooling sleep mask. There's a lot of options for sleep masks, and if any of them sound good to you, you should make sure to check them out at the link in the description and pinned comment, and or use code IDsFantasy to get one for yourself at 10% off and support the channel in the process. Anyway, with how far apart FNAF 3 and Secret of the Mimic are in the timeline, there are a few questions that need to be answered about how a map from the future ended up here, preferably without the use of the time travel ball pit in the explanation. Specifically, we need to explain why the map of a horror attraction from decades later in the timeline is around in the 70s, why the map would be different from the location it's actually found in, and what this means for some of the lore debates in the fandom. The first question is probably the one most people thought of as soon as they saw the map and realized what it was, which is understandable with how little sense it makes at first glance for Edwin Murray to have a map of not only a FNAF location from decades in the future that doesn't actually match the location it's in, but one of the few Five Nights at Freddy's locations that doesn't seem to actually be run by Fazbear Entertainment. Rather, we're told by the first FNAF 3 newspaper that a local amusement park is the one setting up the attraction. However, even if FNAF 3 didn't take place at a Fazbear Run location, that doesn't mean it was never a Fazbear Run location. After all, if Phone Dude and whoever else were working behind the scenes to make things as authentic as possible, what could be more authentic than setting up shop in what used to be an actual Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, or a building that was created to be an accurate recreation of one? After all, there wasn't just one Freddy's location. The franchise was a whole restaurant chain, something that Secret of the Mimic itself confirms with a note from William to an MCM employee asking for the contact information of the rest of Edwin's staff in exchange for getting to be the manager of, quote, one of the new franchise locations. Who this note was to doesn't matter so much as the confirmation that even right off the bat, Freddy's was planned to have multiple locations rather than just knowing that they would end up popping up eventually, with FNAF 3 Phone Dude mentioning that there were multiple buildings. The layout of the prototype Freddy's we see may match FNAF 1 rather than the FNAF 3 map that's displayed, but I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that this map was put here to tell us that FNAF 3's location was originally brainstormed to be, and then originally constructed as a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, which later got repurposed into a horror attraction by people who wanted it to be as authentically Freddy's as possible. And if FNAF 3 was originally a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, I think that has some really interesting implications for one of the biggest debates over one of the few books that is definitely directly connected to the game timeline, the FNAF Survival Logbook. While the logbook has been useful for figuring out plenty of things, such as the name Cassidy for the 5th kid in the missing children incident, and probably Dave for the crying child, as well as knowing that Michael Afton has seen the FNAF 4 Nightmare animatronics, there's been a long-standing debate over when exactly in the timeline the Survival Logbook is supposed to be from. At first glance, the book seems like it would be something Michael Afton, aka Mike Schmidt, aka the player character in FNAF 1, wrote in during his time as a security guard at the FNAF 1 location. It's labeled as a security logbook, even if Mike altered the title, and shows the FNAF 1 versions of the animatronic characters. There's also a sticky note that seems to imply that the book was taken back from Michael after he got fired, apologizing that it's already been written in and asking if the new owner minds, as well as another note that asks the reader to not mention the existence of springlock suits to anyone after a quiz about springlock suit protocol and safety tips. However, the chapter pages for the book don't show the FNAF 1 location. They show FNAF 3, with similar drawings on the walls, the same box of Freddy's animatronic parts on the floor, and the same overall office layout. The office in the drawings is in better condition than the game, but it's still recognizably FNAF 3. Because of this, there's an alternative theory that the Survival Logbook is actually a piece of merchandise meant for the Fazbear's Fright horror attraction. The reason it has the FNAF 3 office would be because it was created in the modern day for the people who would be seeing the Fazbear's Fright version of Freddy's in the present of FNAF 3. However, if FNAF 3 is an actual former Freddy's locations, I think a different option might be more likely than the logbook being made for FNAF 1 or FNAF 3. After all, by the time FNAF 1 and especially FNAF 3 roll around, knowledge of the springlock suits is A, not something Fazbear Entertainment wants getting out, and B, doesn't really seem to be something the Fazbear's Fright people are aware of, considering they found Springtrap and didn't realize that there was a rotting corpse in it, and only found the tapes where Fungi explained what springlocks were at the same time. If the logbook was created around the same time as FNAF 3 or FNAF 1, why would the book have a guide to using the springlock suits that the creators either didn't know about until days before the location burned down, or definitely wouldn't want people to know about in the first place? Not only that, but if this was meant to be for FNAF 3, it's already kind of weird that they'd be giving their security guy merch, but how would they get the logbook back from Mike after the horror attraction burned down, and then give it to someone else? And why would they put a sticky note in the book about not mentioning the springlock suits? Who would they be giving it to, and why try to hide something that would only add to the horror mythos that Fazbear's Fright was operating off of? However, if the original logbook was created early on, back when Fazbear Entertainment was still using springlock suits and the FNAF 3 location was open as a Freddy's, that would explain both of these situations, as well as why the book might be taken back from Michael and given to a new employee. Fazbear is notoriously cheap and lazy, and the idea that they'd reuse out-of-date material from previous locations checks out, considering the phone guy call in FNAF 2 where he goes through a whole thing about how the player is working a summer job even though the location was only open for a couple weeks and we play working there in the fall, potentially implying he's reading off an old script from a previous Freddy's location. Even under the theory where the calls were pre-recorded during the summer and we work after the location's closed, it would go to show that they are willing to reuse outdated training material for their security guards. Additionally, we see in Into the Pit and the FNAF 2 dream cutscenes that the original look of the animatronics was probably the classic FNAF 1 designs before they swapped to the FNAF 2 ones, something I go into more detail about in a previous video of mine I'll link in the description. So the usage of the FNAF 1 designs would make sense then as well, and give Fazbear an excuse to bring back the old logbook at the location where these designs were in use again. Of course, that wouldn't necessarily explain the box of parts shown in the logbook that matches the one in FNAF 3 containing parts from locations that didn't exist that early in the timeline, or some of the random random things in there like Chica using a laptop. Both of these are distinctly more modern FNAF 3 era things, which wouldn't really make sense for a book that was made in the early 1980s. However, I have a couple potential explanations for that as well. One option is that we already know that the actual context of the book can be altered by the spirits using it. Usually this manifests through the appearance of faded or altered text, but there are instances of faded drawings, so why not altered artwork as well? Especially since we know for a fact that the spirits can change the way posters in the environment around them look. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that, since the logbook was in a haunted location and already being messed with by spirits, that the pictures could have been altered over time to match the environments the book and the spirits were in. While the original logbook could have been from early in the timeline before being given to Michael Afton in FNAF 1, then taken and added to with sticky notes from management, it may have ended up in the FNAF 3 location as the Fazbear's Fright crew was looking for memorabilia to put into the location. Alternatively, the artwork in the Five Nights at Freddy's books have a track record of being inaccurate. While I trust the explicitly lore-related stuff that's included in the logbook to have been specifically asked for and vetted by Scott Cawthon, he doesn't necessarily have time to check every single thing, and there are a lot of instances where the supposedly official artwork for the franchise in the books directly contradicts the way things are shown or described in the original material. For example, in the Silver Eyes novel trilogy, the character Jessica is described having brown hair, and the perception-altering illusion discs are described as being small disc-like objects. Meanwhile, the graphic novel shows Jessica with blonde hair, and the illusion discs as computer chips. While the general message is gotten across, things get lost in translation between the actual concept and the artist's interpretation, and that could easily be the case with some of these stranger details in the logbook. While I have no doubt that the stuff like Mike's drawings and the Spears messages were in fact deliberate, I could easily see it being a case where maybe Scott asked for the chapter title pages to show Foxy in a Freddy's office, and the artist, understandably, deliberately copied the reference material closely, and it's not like they would have undamaged Foxy in the pre-FNAF 3 version of the FNAF 3 office that they referenced. Same with the Chica on a laptop. The book itself, in a real-world sense, was created in the modern era, so if there wasn't a hyper-specific direction of on this page draw Chica using a 1980s computer, I could see ending up with Chica on a laptop, just like the illusion discs got turned into illusion chips. Those things aren't important to the lore in the same way that the alterations from Mike, the spirits, and whatever Fazbear employee put the sticky notes in there are, which I'm much more willing to trust as reference for where this book is meant to be from in the timeline, especially with Secret of the Mimic implying the FNAF 3 location was planned to be a Freddy's as of the 70s. Of course, if the logbook is from earlier in the timeline, there's one more elephant in the room, or rather pile of robot spaghetti in the room, that needs to be addressed. Namely, Molten Freddy and the MoltenMCI Sister Location theory. The timeline placement of Sister Location has been hotly debated for years and is very closely connected to when the Survival Logbook was written in by Michael. After all, Michael is confirmed to have written in the logbook after the events of Sister Location, since his drawings reference both the exotic butters and casual bongos jokes from that game. If Michael wrote in the book during FNAF 1, that would put Sister Location before FNAF 1 in the timeline. However, this gets a bit complicated due to a certain theory known as MoltenMCI. The MoltenMCI theory is essentially that after the events of FNAF 1, William Afton took the endoskeletons of the FNAF 1 animatronics, which were possessed by the spirits from the Missing Children incident, or MCI, and had them melted down and reforged into the Funtime animatronics from Sister Location. Eventually, William went back to Freddy's and got spring-locked. Meanwhile, the Funtimes became Ennard and eventually kicked Circus Baby out to become Molten Freddy as a pizzeria simulator. This theory is often treated as confirmed by a large portion of fans for a few reasons. First, there's a page in a book called The Ultimate Guide that draws direct comparisons between a melted-together amalgamation of the Haunted Freddy's animatronics in the Fourth Closet novel and Molten Freddy, saying it gives fans an idea of how Molten Freddy came to be. Second, in Pizzeria Simulator, Henry has two major lore speeches. In the Insanity ending, he talks about realizing just how messed up William was and how small souls have been trapped in prisons of Henry's making, now set to new purpose. He says he didn't know how the souls came to possess the animatronics, but he needs to call them all together in one place to help them find peace. In the main ending, the characters that were lured to the location were William as Scraptrap, Elizabeth Afton as Baby, Charlie as the puppet inside Lefty, and Molten Freddy. Since we don't see the FNAF 1 animatronics in that game, people take this to mean that the FNAF 1 animatronics are represented through Molten Freddy. The third main piece of evidence is from the original Help Wanted, where during the Ennard minigame level, there's a furnace that contains 4 of the Help Wanted versions of the Endo 01 endoskeletons. Endo 01 was the endoskeleton model used in the FNAF 1 animatronics. So with these 4 endos being in the furnace in a level containing Ennard, an amalgamation of the Sister Location animatronics, a lot of people took this to be definitive confirmation that MoltenMCI was correct. However, it's usually not a good idea to treat a theory as confirmed, as Secret of the Mimic itself has proven by debunking the theory that the tales from the Pizzaplex books are in the game timeline, and the MoltenMCI theory is far from without its issues. For one thing, the Ultimate Guide isn't a very reliable source of evidence, having noticeable errors like calling Sister Location Circus Baby's Pizza World instead of Entertainment and Rentals, and saying that FNAF 3 is set 30 years after something we don't know for sure, while one page later saying that Phone Dude says it's been 30 years since the last Freddy's closed, which Phone Dude does not say. The book just says says things that aren't true, and even if it was reliable, saying that the stuff in the fourth closet gives an idea of how Molten Freddy came to be doesn't mean it happened identically. It giving an idea could refer to how the fourth closet animatronics were a combination of a bunch of animatronics just like Molten Freddy was. Or be the ghostwriter assuming that the melted together Freddy's animatronics and the animatronic named Molten Freddy were meant to be the same and just writing it. We don't know, and I wouldn't rely on that for evidence. For help wanted, I see how the endos in the furnace works as MoltenMCI evidence. However, the fact that there are only 4 endoskeletons in there when there were 5 kids involved makes me inclined to believe that unless we're saying only 4 of the kids are actually in Molten Freddy, this isn't the confirmation people treat it as, especially of the popular version of the MoltenMCI theory. Evidence, sure, and you could say that the 5th kid just followed the rest of them, but at that point, the MoltenMCI name would be a bit of a misnomer considering the fact that one of the MCI kids wouldn't be there. Not to mention, it's been pointed out that Scrap Trap's design in Pizzeria Simulator kind of looks like it had Golden Freddy parts grafted onto it to replace some of the Spring Bonnie parts, which combined with how the Vengeful Spirit is able to trap William in Ultimate Custom Night may imply that Golden Freddy's spirit was more following William after he grafted the parts onto himself rather than Molten Freddy. Not to mention, if the 4 animatronics were supposed to be melted down into the Fun Times, technically speaking they shouldn't even be in the furnace at all. Ennard is the combination of all the Funtime animatronics and is the main antagonist of the level. He is physically present and separate from the endoskeletons in the furnace. So honestly, I'd say it makes just as much sense to say this furnace setup was the developers trying to prove that Ennard and the FNAF 1 animatronics are in fact entirely separate from each other. Alternatively, the furnace could just be a reference generally to instances of the animatronics, including the FNAF 1 group, being burned in the franchise, whether that be in FNAF 3, which had the FNAF 1 animatronics parts present, Pizzeria Simulator, where the spirits are indicated to be, or even a direct reference to the events of the novel trilogy where the animatronics end up in a furnace. After all, Steel Wool has a track record of referencing the novel trilogy in their games, as shown by the underground lake in Ruin evoking a similar circumstance in the Twisted Ones novel, and main game Security Breach having a mall-like structure built to conceal a Freddy Fazbear's restaurant like in the Silver Eyes. As for the idea that Pizzeria Simulator confirms MoltenMCI, the main evidence here is that we don't see the classic animatronics in the FNAF 6 Pizzeria, despite Henry talking about calling everyone back after talking about William's victims for a few paragraphs. Yet the spirits are pretty much guaranteed to be present in the ending scene of their graves. Therefore, if the only spirits we know the confirmed identities of are Elizabeth and Scrap Baby, Charlie in the puppet in Lefty, and William in Scrap Trap, wouldn't that have to mean that Molten Freddy is the MCI kids? Well, no. Just because we don't see the original animatronics during Pizzeria Simulator doesn't mean they aren't present. Henry had to find out what happened to the kids somehow and know that they were in the animatronics he built. If he never had access to them to see that they were haunted by the kids by that point in time, how did he find out what happened to them? I find it much more likely that Henry got a hold of the animatronic heads and parts that were present in FNAF 3 thanks to the auction that happened after the fire there, and then realized something was up when they, were ominously glowing. I find this especially likely considering the fact that while we don't see them in Pizzeria Simulator, we know for a fact that there's not only all sorts of Fazbear and non-Fazbear related junk in the building because of Ruin, but we literally see parts of what look to be FNAF 1 animatronics in that very location as part of the Blob, or Tangle, if you want to call it that. While it's unclear if the Blob got these parts from the FNAF 6 location directly or stole them from the displays on Rockstar Row in the Pizzaplex, which likely would have had to come from somewhere that may or may not have been the conveniently located pizzeria underneath the building, the fact that the eyes of the Chica and Bonnie portions of the Blob, which do include some endoskeleton parts if you look closely enough, are lit up, while the puppet mask is missing its tears that it got after getting possessed and doesn't have its eyes lit, implies to me that at least the puppet mask is meant to be the original in the FNAF 6 location, and that these instances of glowing or not glowing eyes are meant to show that as much as the Blob may have agony and remnant from a variety of sources, the eyes glowing or not glowing in regards to specific animatronic heads has meaning. You could say that these are replica parts or the FNAF AR animatronics that somehow ended up here. And there is a Circus Baby mask there despite Elizabeth last taking the form of Scrap Baby. But not only are Circus Baby's eyes not lit, implying a lack of possession, but I feel like putting a blob of clearly haunted robot spaghetti containing animatronic parts whose spirits were in the area before it got set on fire implies that those spirits were likely present through those bodies that they were possessing. Molten Freddy's spirits that Henry mentions in Pizzeria Simulator probably weren't from the MCI, but from the fact that it was composed of animatronics that were specifically built to lure away and kill children, as shown by Circus Baby killing Elizabeth, who, if the MoltenMCI theory was true, probably should have been sharing Circus Baby and Scrap Baby with the MCI kids whose remnant would have theoretically been a part of her. Henry's speech addressed the MCI kids and their circumstances because he already had access to them and could figure out what happened to them because he could see them. But in order for those spirits to rest and for any other ones that William hurt, including his daughter, to find peace, he had to call all the others back to put them all to rest at the same time. Otherwise, the spirits that he had already found wouldn't be able to rest. You can believe MoltenMCI if you want, but the evidence for it is debatable at best, as most things in the franchise are. I personally find it unlikely that William was alive after FNAF 1 at all, since I feel like the phone guy recorded recording in FNAF 3 about safe rooms being sealed in a game about the guy who was sealed in a safe room is probably about the guy who was sealed in a safe room at the location where the recordings were found, and Phone Guy died in FNAF 1. Not to mention, I find it highly unlikely that William harvested the endoskeletons of the FNAF 1 animatronics, somehow got permission to build the fun times after he burnt his connections with the franchise by killing kids and had to pretend to be a security guard to work at FNAF 2 and kill more kids, then created the fun times and Circus Baby's Pizza World, lost his daughter to Circus Baby, started at the Sister Location rental service, and then went back to Freddy's for some reason just to get chased into a springlock suit and somehow get sealed in the safe room, despite the location being abandoned, instead of it just all happening in one night before FNAF 1. If you want more of my thoughts on the situation in the Follow Me minigames, I recommend checking out my last theory video on how the whole design situation between Edwin and Henry probably worked throughout the early timeline. But either way, if you combine all this with the fact that there are counterpoints to the MoltenMCI evidence with the logbook having drawings of Sister Location during a time period when it would make sense to depict the FNAF 3 office layout, and for someone at Fazbear Entertainment to actually take back the book and put a note covering up the springlocks in there, I really don't think MoltenMCI or Sister Location being after FNAF 1 is the case. But hey, it's just a theory, and it's totally fine if you disagree with my interpretations or pick and choose which ones you want to go with. Pretty much nothing is confirmed at the end of the day, so you're free to believe whatever you want, and I'm happy to have you here either way. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to check out the pins or Man to Sleep if you're interested. Don't get stabbed, and have a nice day.